People tend to think about fashion as a fashion industry, or they think about fashion as a product to be sold, or something like that. Very few people actually look at fashion and go, okay, this is a really important cultural form. Let's think about it as a cultural form, see what it says, see what it does, see how it operates, these sorts of things. What kind of cultural resonances does it have, and so on and so forth. People seem to be quite happy to talk about literature, film, music, art, all of these things, and they'll talk about them quite happily as cultural forms that have a load of really important ideas behind them. But nobody talks about fashion like that. And I think they should, because I think fashion is more important perhaps than people like to give it credit for.
In what manner?
Fashion does a number of things, and obviously not all fashion. In the same way as not all literature, in the same way as not all film. But there are moments in fashion, like there are moments in literature, where it articulates a set of ideas. It expresses a lot of the time what it means to be human, and in particular what it means to be a woman or to be feminine. And of course, as we know from psychoanalysis, to be a woman and to be feminine are not necessarily one and the same thing. But fashion articulates ideas about femininity in a way that many other cultural forms don't, and that's what makes fashion really unique, as far as I'm concerned. I think when I should be quite clear at this stage, before the interview gets too old, that when I'm talking about fashion, I'm talking about creativity in dress. So I'm not necessarily talking about style. I'm not necessarily talking about what people would wear day to day. What I'm talking about is how we can be quite creative with our adornment of the body. And fashion does something really interesting. Is it an addition to the body, or is it an extension of the body? It makes the body's boundaries kind of indeterminate, in a sense. But yeah, it's, like I say, fashion is, for me, primarily concerned with creativity in dress. So it's not something that we all do every day when we get dressed in the morning. That's not really fashion. It's when we get creative with our dress and start presenting something that can be quite unusual, that's there to be interpreted, and so on and so forth. That is when fashion gets really interesting, for me. It's I think meaning changes over time. And I think we can say this for all creative forms. So I mean, when you first see, I don't know, a Picasso painting or an Andy Warhol painting, when these things were first produced, they were groundbreaking, epoch-defining works of outstanding genius. Now we print them on posters and students pin them on their wall with drawing pins. They mean something very different. This is just what happens as the relationship between creative form and the people looking at it changes over time. And I think it happens with fashion, I think it happens with art, I think it happens with all creative and cultural forms. I personally don't subscribe to the idea of, a linear time where something is, what's in the past is diminished compared to what's in the present, which means that the future is going to be better. I don't really subscribe to that point of view. I think that what happened in the past is just as valid now as it was then. It's just different. We have a different relationship with it. We've seen it before. We've talked about it a lot. We've interpreted it, whatever. So we have a different relationship with it. It may not be quite as crucial, quite as vitally important, but I don't think it's diminished. Time doesn't always diminish things. It changes them, but it doesn't always diminish them, if that makes sense.
It does.
Let's stick with the 60s, because that's an interesting time. Are you talking about the mini skirts? We're talking about the mini skirts and the boots and the beehive hairdos. Okay. There was a lot of very interesting things going on in the 60s. Why did we have, for instance, mini skirts then? Mary Quant is usually credited with designing the mini skirt. It actually came from André Courrèges, who was famous for his kind of space age designs. So there was a kind of optimism in the 60s where people were looking forward. The trauma and the rigours of World War II had largely been dealt with, and it was no longer recovering from the war. It was a point where people were starting to look forward. So you get a lot of very kind of new. It was very much an emphasis on the new. And we'd seen it before, in the 1920s when hemlines came up, So it does happen. It does have a precedence. It was also a time when women's rights were beginning to take shape. The women's movement obviously didn't start until later in the 60s, but you had Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique from the 1950s, and there was a general sense that things were changing. It was a period where things were moving forward, and the miniskirt, iconic as it is, was very much a part of that. In terms of psychoanalysis and fashion, designers generally, fashion generally doesn't directly engage with psychoanalysis. So the relationship between fashion and psychoanalysis tends not to come at the creative point. It comes in interpretation. So it comes once the fashion's been made. One of the ways that we can understand fashion is through taking psychoanalytic ideas, taking what psychoanalysis tells us about the human subject and how the human subject or how human subjectivity can be expressed in creative forms. And this was obviously something that Freud was very interested in. He talked a lot about plays, he talked a lot about art, and subsequently, of course, people have taken that principle and also talk about film and literature and, for me, fashion. So psychoanalysis and fashion, really, it's a question of interpretation. Fashion, people who work in fashion are generally aware of things like fantasy, but it's fantasy with an F, not the psychoanalytic fantasy with a PH. They are aware of the idea of an interior life. This is very much a characteristic of modern life anyway, the idea that we all have some sort of interior life, which then manifests itself, is expressed in various ways. What you tend to find is that people who work in fashion assume that the interior life is something we can have access to, that we can make choices about. And one of the really important things about Freud is that he tells us that actually our interior life is ultimately inaccessible. We can't get to it. It's the unconscious. The unconscious will express itself in various ways. It will express itself in the analytic experience. It will express itself in art. It will express itself through dreams. We can't actually contact it. We have no control over it. It's something that's way deep within us that we have no choice over. So that's where I think most people's idea of psychoanalysis falls down. The idea that the unconscious is something that we have a choice about, that we can interact with. No. And that's the really important thing about Freud. And that's why when we're talking about fashion and psychoanalysis, I will get to my point, when we're talking about fashion and psychoanalysis, what is really interesting is the ways that we can think about ideas about the unconscious and ideas about human subjectivity and see fashion as almost a dream, or almost the expression of unconscious things that otherwise we would not be able to access, we would not be able to discuss, we would not be able to present. And I think that's one of the things that fashion does. Would fashion be different without Freud? I have no idea. It would be interesting to think about. The answer is possibly. One of the characteristics of modern life is the idea of an interior life. And we see this in, for instance, the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. We see it in A Picture of Dorian Gray, the idea, that there is another self. And I think fashion does rely on the idea of another self. Certainly in the 1920s, with Surrealism, for instance, the Surrealist artists were very aware of psychoanalytic ideas, and they formed the basis of they formed the basis of the Surrealist art movement. Surrealists didn't just take photos and paint pictures. Surrealists also produced fashion, not to a great extent. Obviously, they predominantly produced paintings and photographs, but Dali produced a couple of garments. Elsa Schiaparelli particularly was a fashion designer who worked with Surrealist ideas and manifested Surrealist ideas in fashion. So does fashion work with the idea of psychoanalysis? Has psychoanalysis influenced fashion? Yes, it has. But I think it's done so in ways that are really quite intractable. It's not the case that designers go, oh, well, there is an unconscious mind. Dreams are the road to the unconscious. There is the Oedipus complex. There is this and that. Therefore, we will incorporate this in our designs. It's not that straightforward. I think it's much more subtle. I think it's much more a case of the idea of the unconscious, the idea of the self being multifaceted and complex, the idea that sexuality is crucial to human identity. That's something we get from Freud, and that's something that's absolutely central to fashion. The extent to which the fashion world is familiar with psychoanalytic ideas is another matter entirely. I'm not sure I would directly relate the miniskirt to sexuality directly. What I would say is that in fashion generally, there is an awareness that the reason we put clothes on is very closely related to the reasons we take them off. In terms of fashion and sexuality and psychoanalysis, psychoanalysis had a very particular set of ideas about human sexuality and the development of human sexuality. There were a number of other sexologists, writers, critics who were talking about sexuality at the same time as Freud. But what makes Freud unique is that he separates the idea of sexual desire on the one hand and sexual aim on the other. So we're all born, for Freud, we're all born with sexual desire. But where that desire goes, what that desire is for, is a variable. For many other sexologists, they were one and the same. So you were born with a sexual desire, and the aim was, say, heterosexual sex, homosexual sex, whatever, fetishistic sex, whatever. And the two were inextricably linked. For other sexologists, for Freud, they were two very different things. And that's interesting in terms of fashion, because what it means is that when fashion manifests certain types of sexuality, they are, in theory, routes that any of us could have taken, because we're all born with sexual desire. The aim is different. The aim is developmental. And really, any of us could have gone in any one of a number of directions. So one of the fantastic things about fashion is it says that. It says, this is the, this particular idea, whatever, is, the desire. The aim. And anyone could potentially have gone that way, and that's what's really interesting. One of the things that I find really interesting about it. What's springing to mind immediately when you say that is the idea that even if you don't know about Freud, if you don't know about psychoanalysis per se, the ideas that they embody can appear in fashion products, in fashion creations. One of the things that I was thinking about when that question arose was the jewellery of a British designer called Sean Lane. He uses a lot of spikes. His jewellery is quite aggressive looking, really. It's very angular, it's very sharp. He worked a lot with Alexander McQueen, and Alexander McQueen's Eshu collection in particular had jewellery from Sean Lane that was very, very interesting. And there's just something a bit kind of perverted about it, but in a good way. It's a deviant model of sexuality, but in the sense that the world needs deviance in order to progress. If we all just do what we're told, then we stagnate. We need deviance. We need people who diverge from the norm. And Sean Lane's jewellery is very much an example of sexuality that deviates from the norm. The reasons we put clothes on are closely related to the reasons why we take them off.
Would you elaborate that?
Sure, and that basic idea, the very first book ever written on fashion and psychoanalysis was J.C. Flugel's The Psychology of Clothes, and that was published in 1930. Flugel's work is not without its problems, and these days it seems very, very dated. But what was very important about that is about Flugel's work, and the one thing that remains important today is the idea that there is a very close relationship between fashion and sexuality. For me, it's a question of that turn of phrase is perhaps a little glib, but what it does do is make the relationship between psychoanalysis and fashion and sexuality abundantly clear. It just says that that relationship exists. How then we would extrapolate that is subject to, depends what fashion you're talking about, depends what sexuality you're talking about, and so on and so forth. But it's that expression, where the reason you wear clothes is closely related to the reason you take them off. All that does really is create a link between fashion, psychoanalysis and sexuality, which you can then extrapolate on. What would Freud say about the selfie? He would probably see it as one of the as a manifestation of one of the neuroses. There's nothing particularly radical about it. It's actually the internalization of everything that we're expected to believe in. So it's, how the superego would shape the subject in the 21st century, to use Freud's terms, I think can be used very helpfully to explain the selfie. There's nothing particularly radical about the selfie. It's not going in quite the contrary. In fact, the idea of the selfie is one that is actually profoundly conservative. It's very much a very obedient cultural form, but it's not a resistance to the dominant order. It's a neurotic response to the dominant social order. Not necessarily the government, but the dominant social idea about human subjectivity. It's narcissistic, it's self-contained, it's independent, and so on and so forth.
So it's neurotic.
Mm-hmm.
It's neurotic.
Yes, I would say. I may be wrong on this. I would quite happy to be proved wrong on this, but this is just my thought. Is the selfie neurotic behaviour? I think it's a neurotic cultural form. Whether everybody who takes selfies is neurotic, I couldn't tell you, because I'm not sitting with them, they're not on the couch, I'm not sitting behind them listening to what they say. And the only way you can really diagnose an individual is in a psychoanalytic therapeutic encounter. So I'm not going to make comments on the psychological state of people, individuals who indulge in a particular sort of behaviour. That's not what psychoanalysis is about, and personally I also think it's a bit unethical to do that. However, as a cultural form, do I think the concept of the selfie, the practice of selfies is neurotic? Yes, probably.